Imagine the 1920s. The world is roaring with post-war life, and cars are filling the roads. In America, modern society is racing forward with the arrival of radio, cinema, and the jazz age. Yet in the rugged Sierra Madre mountains of Mexico, time had nearly stood still. Here around 100 free Apache continued their way of life, seemingly untouched by the passage of modernity. Known as the Bronco Apache, these men, women, and children were ghosts. In the eyes of local Mexican villagers and ranchers, they moved through the mountains with the knowledge that every raid, every stolen cow, or each sighting meant risking exposure, and possibly their lives. For decades they endured through stealth, hiding, and the sheer strength of spirit that had carried their people through centuries of relentless opposition. Their story would culminate in tragedy, driven by vengeance and loss. But it is a chapter in Apache history that defies easy explanation. Locals knew of the Bronco Apache. They were no mystery to those living in the Sierra Madre region. Instead, they were a shadowed presence. Children were warned to stay close to home, not to wander into the forests, where it was said Apache eyes could always find them. It was common for villagers to hear eerie sounds in the night, calls that seemed animistic, but were just slightly off, suggesting that something more was lurking. Often a missing animal or two was the only trace that the Apache had visited, but sometimes people went missing too, usually women or children who were rumored to have been taken to replace lost members of Apache families. For the people who lived near these mountains, the Bronco Apache had come to represent both legend and danger, even the most peaceful. Ranchers respected an unspoken boundary, a tax they paid through lost livestock, which kept them safe from a more direct and deadly encounter. These ranchers knew that if they pursued the Apache, they might not return. We are often taught that the Apache Wars ended in 1886 when Geronimo surrendered. That event, however, marked only the end of the U.S. Army's pursuit of the Apache. In reality, resistance endured in the form of the Bronco Apache, who fought to remain free, their struggle persisting even through the 1930s. As the last remaining free Apache, they embodied resilience and a refusal to surrender, despite generations of trauma. But all of this would soon change, with one man's relentless quest for revenge. A man named Francisco Fibbers would alter their fate forever. In October 1927, Francisco Fibbers, a Mexican rancher, rode urgently, with a group of men, to the site of a recent Apache raid. The air was thick with tension as Francisco dismounted his horse and rushed to a bloody scene. His wife lay motionless near a ravine, her body riddled with stab wounds. Kneeling beside her, he began to sob, but quickly looked around with a look of rising panic. His young son was missing, taken by the Apache in an instant. Francisco's grief transformed into a fiery rage, and from that moment on, he became a man with two singular purposes: to find his son and to eliminate every Apache still hiding in those mountains. For Francisco, this wasn't merely revenge. It was a deeply personal mission. He knew well enough that the Apache had raided before. Small incidents of cattle theft or supplies gone missing were common enough in these parts. But this attack, this violation of his own family, was a transgression too far. Francisco could hardly imagine another father in the region who wouldn't have sought revenge, and he became consumed by it. The Apache resistance is a story of enduring courage, one that extends beyond the surrender of Geronimo. After 1886, small bands of Apache withdrew into remote areas, preferring freedom to the captivity and forced relocation that awaited them if they were captured. Some went to reservations, adapting in various ways, but a significant group remained hidden. The Bronco Apache represented the ultimate Apache, holdouts living in the Sierra Madre, with an unwavering determination to maintain their freedom, even in dwindling numbers. They were more than warriors. They were survivors of the longest resistance against colonization in the history of the Americas. Over the centuries, they faced the Spanish, the Comanche, and the Mexican and American governments, each of whom wanted them either captured, relocated, or exterminated. Yet they continued to. The Mexican villagers and ranchers of the early 1900s, the Bronco Apache, were almost mythological. They were the boogeymen of the untamed wilderness, always felt but rarely seen. Entire hunting parties would find campsites with smoldering embers, the Apache having vanished minutes before they arrived. For the Bronco Apache, the locals were merely an obstacle to survival. In such small numbers, they couldn't afford to confront enemies directly. Instead, they had become masters of stealth, moving quietly through the mountains and rarely engaging unless provoked. This calculated approach kept them free, if perpetually wary, but Francisco Fimbra's family tragedy would trigger a final, tragic series of events on that fateful day. Francisco, his wife Maria, their young son Geraldo, and their daughter were traveling near the town of Nacaraquico in Sonora. As they rode along a narrow path through the Sierra Madre foothills, Francisco stayed back with his daughter, while Maria and Geraldo rode ahead. The family had only just passed a large boulder when disaster struck in one account. Francisco heard a gunshot ring out, watching in horror as Maria fell from her horse, protecting their son in her arms, while Apache raiders emerged from behind the rock. In another version, Maria was dragged from the horse by several Apache, including women who then began stabbing her with knives. No matter the version, the outcome was the same. Geraldo was taken, and Francisco had to make an impossible choice: confront the raiders to save his wife and son, or retreat to protect his daughter. Ultimately, he chose the latter, retreating down the trail and hiding his daughter in a bush before seeking out help. Returning with a group of ranchers, Francisco found Maria's lifeless body, but Geraldo was nowhere to be seen. Haunted by his decision, Francisco was tortured by doubt and regret. This moment of hesitation, this split-second decision to save one child and lose another, would gnaw at him, perhaps fueling his subsequent actions. Driven by guilt and a sense of duty, Francisco would not rest until he had brought his son and exacted revenge on the Apache. Over the next several years, Francisco embarked on countless expeditions into the Sierra Madre, rallying local ranchers to his cause. He sought the guidance of a young Apache woman named Lupi, who had been adopted into the village. Lupi, however, urged Francisco to abandon his mission. She had once lived among the Apache and knew how elusive they were. She believed that Francisco would never find them. In the mountains they would see him coming, long before he ever neared their camps. When Francisco attempted to recruit her as a guide, she refused, terrified of what the Apache would do to her if they discovered her aiding their enemy. Lupe also warned Francisco that pursuing the Apache could endanger his son's life. She believed that if the Apache sensed they were being hunted, they might kill Geraldo to ensure no one tracked them. However, if they felt unthreatened, they might adopt the boy, as they had done with captives in the past. Lupe suggested waiting a few years before attempting a rescue, allowing time for the Apache to grow attached to Geraldo. Francisco, unable to let go of his paternal instinct, dismissed this plan. He could not passively hope that his son might be spared. In the years that followed, Francisco's attempts to track the Bronco Apache were thwarted. Each expedition resulted in dead ends, empty trails, and abandoned campsites, even as he tried more covert methods, using dark clothing, moving in silence, and avoiding fires. He found no trace of his son or the elusive Apache. The Apache's legendary skills in evading detection had once stymied the U.S. military, which had relied on Apache scouts to track other Apache. During the Apache Wars, Francisco's attempts, though determined, were ultimately in vain. His target was a needle in the haystack of the Sierra Madre, and he was growing increasingly desperate. At the same time, an American researcher named Grenville Goodwin was embarking on his own quest to understand Apache culture and history. Obsessed with the idea of these last free Apache, Goodwin collected information from newspaper articles and reservation contacts. His fascination was as much romanticized as it was scholarly. He traveled to Mexico, hoping to make contact with the Bronco Apache, though his attempts, like Francisco's, failed. Goodwin's findings were later compiled into the Apache Diaries by his son, a book that revealed much about how the Apache adapted to their environment. According to Goodwin, the Bronco Apache were resourceful but far from self-sufficient. They hunted and gathered food, but relied on raiding and occasional trading to supplement their needs. They were not isolated hermits. They adapted as best they could to a changing world, forming relationships with local Mexican communities where they could. Some of these relationships were tenuous, but others were almost symbiotic. Some villagers even allowed the Apache to raid their livestock, understanding it was preferable to a direct encounter. While tensions occasionally led to violent confrontations, some ranchers struck silent agreements, allowing the Apache to take a few cattle in exchange for being left in peace. It was an uneasy balance, one that could shift at any time. These unwritten rules kept the Bronco Apache on the fringes of society, but it also enabled them to survive in a world that was ever encroaching upon their way of life. By the early 1930s, Finbras's desperate search for his son began attracting significant attention in the Southwest. Despite his pleas, the Mexican government showed no official support, unwilling to risk involvement in an international affair. Undeterred, Finbras sought allies elsewhere, eventually finding support from eager volunteers in the United States. The Douglas Daily Dispatch published a call for volunteers, inviting people to join the effort, and the response was overwhelming. The enthusiasm from American volunteers quickly outstripped that from Mexican counterparts, with many sending letters pleading to be part of what was advertised as the last Apache hunt. Some of these letters have been preserved, reflecting the curiosity and dedication of these volunteers. Finbras's mission was packaged with a sense of finality and adventure-stoking emotions among those who viewed the campaign as a righteous pursuit. Yet as the American numbers swelled, the Mexican government grew uneasy. The idea of hundreds of armed Americans roaming their soil was troubling, especially given that many were not shy about expressing their interest in potential riches rumored to lie in the Sierra Madre Mountains. Stories of hidden veins of gold, silver, and copper had long circulated, and it seemed likely that some of these volunteers would be as interested in mining for fortune as they were in aiding Finbras. This growing concern finally led Mexican officials to shut the venture down before it could truly begin. But Finbras, unwilling to abandon his pursuit, pushed forward, and it was this persistence that eventually paid off in a rather grim discovery. In April of 1930, with a small group of just 12 men on horseback, Finbras rode out from Nicaragua, aiming to investigate an uncharted area in the Sierra Madre. They were following rumors and leads, moving deeper into unfamiliar territory. Before long, they came upon signs of an Apache camp. Broncos had reportedly ambushed a small between Nicaragua and Casas Grandes, and days into their search, Finbras's group saw smoke from a distant campfire. They approached cautiously, moving in silence at first. They spotted only two Apache women, who were sitting together, unaware of the approaching threat. The men raised their rifles, taking aim. The first shot struck one of the women in the arm, and she screamed "nays," the Apache term for Mexicans. The second woman yelled out for Apache Juan, and it was clear they knew they were outmatched. The posse fired again, killing both women before they could flee. A group of Apache, startled by the shots, tried to escape into the forest, but one man stayed back, Apache Juan, who stood his ground to defend his tribe. He was vastly outnumbered and well aware of the danger, yet he began firing back, his shots landing perilously close to Finbras's men. Eventually they were able to pin him down, flanking him until one shot finally hit, wounding him before the group moved in and completed the deadly encounter. In the stillness that followed, Finbras's men took stock of the camp. They gathered whatever valuables they found, including saddles, rifles, and personal Apache trinkets, items they intended to keep as mementos of their mission. However, they made two fateful decisions before they left. They scouted the dead but chose not to bury the bodies, leaving them exposed under the harsh sun. Finbras hoped that this blatant display would strike fear into the Apache people and motivate them to release his son Geraldo. However, the Apache were not a people easily intimidated, and the gamble would not end as Finbras had hoped. A chilling photograph from this event appeared in the Arizona Daily Star, capturing Finbras's group in what seemed a grim victory moment. Despite repeated cautions from Lupe, a trusted advisor who had warned against antagonizing the Apache further, Finbras believed his mission depended on fear and intimidation, an approach that echoed the Mexican government's own tactics in the past century of clashes with the Apache. But the Apache were not easily broken, and as history had repeatedly proven, such tactics usually ended poorly for those who underestimated the tribe's resolve. Days after the violent encounter, Two Mexican men traveling on horseback near the site noticed an unmistakable stench. Investigating, they discovered that the three Apache had been respectfully buried by their companions, who had returned later. But beside those graves lay another, a hastily dug, shallow grave with the unmistakable form of Geraldo. His legs were partially exposed, a clear sign of torture marking his small body. Geraldo would have been about 7 years old at the time. This discovery shattered Finbris. What began as a father's quest for justice and hope had now morphed into a vendetta, marked by loss and unimaginable grief. His once unshakable drive to retrieve his son now transformed into a burning desire for revenge. Blood feuds have etched a painful legacy across Native American history, and Finbris's pursuit of vengeance was no different. Yet there was an irony to his mission. Finbris had initially sought vengeance for the attack on his wife and son, seeing it as an act of unprovoked brutality. However, this tragic conflict had deeper roots. Nearly 2 decades earlier, in 1915, Finbris had joined a group of ranchers chasing down broncos suspected of cattle theft. They captured a young Apache girl who was later baptized and adopted. This girl, Lupe, believed that from that moment on, her family, the Finbris household, was under the watchful eye of Apache Juan and her own mother years later. She had asked to return to her people, a request that was granted, though with severe consequences. Her family told her she was no longer welcome with the Apache, and if she attempted to return again, they would kill her. Lupe, the same woman who had advised Finbris since 1927, later realized that the woman Finbris group killed in 1930 was likely her own mother, and the other victim was her sister. This intense cycle of violence between the Broncos and Finbris family continued relentlessly. By 1930, for anthropologist Grenville Goodwin estimated that only about 30 Broncos were left. His calculations were based on cattle thefts reported by local ranches and an estimate of the Apache's dietary needs. This figure, while imprecise, provided insight into the dwindling population. Historical records from this time are fragmented and sometimes conflicting, adding an air of mystery to Finbris's story. Some sources describe an incident in 1933 where Finbris, a raid that killed 2 dozen Apache. While a similar report from 1932 mentions fewer casualties. Events from Tucson in 1934 are eerily similar to those from 1935, where Finbris group reportedly ambushed Apache after a heavy snowfall, and in both years some Apache children were captured but died within a year. By 1935, news of these conflicts began to wane, and many speculated that the Apache had finally been driven out or exterminated. However, in 1937, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad led an expedition in the Sierra Madre to seek out any remaining Apache. Though he reported finding none, there were hints he had stumbled upon something significant. Ingstad's Apache guides, Unoza among them, and evidence of recent Apache presence. A year later, in 1938, 2 Mescaleros reservation residents shared stories of wild Apache who had visited speaking Spanish. Rumors of hidden Apache communities persisted over the following decades, often relayed by locals who claimed distant connections to these tribes. In the late 1940s, anthropologist Tom Hinton heard accounts from individuals who claimed to have seen men dressed in traditional Apache attire, living quietly among the remote Mexican mountains. Speculation has persisted for decades. Some believe the Bronco Apache assimilated into remote villages, while others hold to the romantic notion that a hidden Apache community survives undisturbed, somewhere within the rugged Sierra Madre landscape. The land remains vast and largely unexplored, and every so often rumors emerge of sightings. The idea of stumbling upon a hidden tribe, elusive and resilient, is both thrilling and haunting. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave any questions, comments, or suggestions below. I'll try to get to them as soon as I can.